This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are back here in the studio in Colorado. I guess that's kind of would be assumed, given that at least here in the United States, everybody is back home, wherever home base happens to be. We have been continuing to put out shows. In fact, as you know, if you've been following the show, you know that this is actually now starting, yes, season 16. We started this show in 2005. I have a hard time even thinking about the fact that we started this show before iTunes even existed. And this has been a great ride. We're having a lot of fun doing the show. We've got a lot of great guests coming up. We've got a pretty full list of interesting topics. So you're going to want to make sure you're subscribed wherever you get your podcast, however you listen. Make sure you flag your indicator so you get told when new shows come out. We're pretty consistent. We put a show out each week, and we average about 50 unique shows a year. So you'll have plenty of content to enjoy, particularly in the topics that we cover: design, innovation, human creativity, leadership, teamwork, all the things that are needed and are even going to be more needed as we go into uncertain futures and what the new normal looks like for all of us. So, and with that, particularly today's subject is one of that I got really excited about. The way we find guests in many cases is people are coming out with new books, and the publicists reach out to see if we would be willing to have guests on. And to be quite honest, probably like 95% of them we do not take because subject matter doesn't match to you, our audience. However, this one matched when the team here at Killer Innovations forwarded me the background on this one. I got really excited. It is actually a topic that we have covered here on the show before, but we've covered it at a very kind of, I would call it almost a veneer level. More intellectual of, yeah, it's important, but not really the how and why background. So that's really what we're going to cover in today's show. So today's guest is Stefan Thomke. Stefan is the William Barclay Harding Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He has authored a series of books around innovation, but in particularly the book that we're going to talk about today is Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. Stefan, welcome to Killer Innovations.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
So, give us a little bit of background on yourself. We were talking before we started the broadcast today about, comparing where you were from in Germany and how much time I've spent there because of my mobile background. But share with the audience, give us a little bit of a background on yourself.
So, Phil, I'm an engineer. I'm an electrical engineer, and I got really interested in experimentation way back in the early 90s. In fact, in 1990, I remember I was working. I was working in the summer there as an engineer. I was an engineering intern, and I got a really difficult problem. I had to optimize a chip manufacturing process, and I was looking at all these different variables, and I was scratching my head. I thought, how the hell am I going to do this? And then someone sort of told me and said, have you ever looked at sort of experimental design? And I never heard of it. And I started to get a few books, and I thought, wow, this is really powerful. And I started to read, and I solved the problem. And later, when I went back to grad school, I was at MIT. I started to pursue this. I got really into it and so forth. And I basically realized that experimentation is the engine of innovation. And so I studied innovation and product development, but I really sort of really went very, very deep in sort of the field of experimentation. So that's where I came from, an engineer, but got into this through engineering, and then later sort of expanded it to lots of things.
Well, it's interesting from the standpoint of the overall role of I think a lot of innovators say they go, yeah, great, experimentation is important, but it's more of, in many cases, it's like, stumbling in the dark, right? You're hoping the experiment leads to what I call the myth of innovation, which is you're waiting for that eureka moment. Like you try something and you accidentally discover versus, having an approach or a methodology. Is that the case for a lot of innovators? I mean, at least the ones I interact with, that's kind of the perspective I hear about all the time.
Phil, part of the problem is the word experimentation itself, the way we use it sort of in the common English language here. When someone says, I experiment, and what they're really saying is I'm trying something. Or often in companies, they did something and it didn't work, and therefore it must have been an experiment. No, that's not what I'm talking about in the book. I'm talking about disciplined experimentation, following kind of principles employed in the scientific method, following the scientific method. And I have a very clear definition in the book of sort of what an experiment really is. And why is that important, Phil? Well, it is important because at the end of the day, you want to learn something from an experiment. And unless you make it disciplined, unless you sort of put sort of a methodology in it, you can't really learn very much from it.
Well, and it's interesting because in your book, you specifically call out the difference between an experiment and a mistake, right?
Yes.
And so explain to the audience the difference between how you think about an experiment and then a mistake.
So often, of course, experiments lead to what we call failures. And in fact, when we look at sort of the online world, one of the constants that I'm finding is that about 8 or 9 out of 10 things that they actually run as experiments don't work. So that's a failure. But of course, failure is a loaded word, Phil. And people don't like to fail at work. It's not a good recommendation. And so I draw this distinction between what I call a failure and a mistake. A mistake is something where you really learn nothing. There's no value added.
Right.
And you want to minimize these kinds of things. Like, we worked on a project and we picked the wrong material and we're picking the wrong material again or something like that. There's no learning going. We haven't learned from the last time. That's very different than a failure. A failure, and this is important when you think about an experiment, a failure has a learning objective, right? A mistake doesn't have a learning objective. And then, when you sort of accept that an experiment needs to have a learning objective, then a failure is okay. And in fact, a lot of environments, it's actually normal sort of operating procedure.
Yeah, and it is interesting from the standpoint because that concept of a mistake, I've always been trying to talk about, this fear of failure and how do you get over this culture and how do you get leaders not to cause some kind of retribution because it's a failure, right? But I think the fact that, you've described it as these two buckets, right? Mistakes should not be tolerated and we should correct ourselves from the standpoint of learning. But it doesn't, if you fail and learn, that's good. You fail and don't learn, there's no value generated from the effort. And you run the risk of just repeating it over and over and over again.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, when you listen to Jeff Bezos, for example, he talks about this a lot, right, by the way. And he makes this really interesting point of saying, failure is quite normal because if you already know what's going to happen before you run the experiment, what's the point of running the experiment? Of course, so surprises coming out of an experiment is the normal thing. So you have to have an environment, that when you talk about culture now, you have to have an environment that, or a culture that values surprises, despite the difficulty of assigning a dollar figure to them. And so when you adopt that kind of mindset, then curiosity will in fact prevail. And people will see failures not as costly mistakes.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because I think, we tend to fall back on how our own history, like, oh, I know that's going to work, or I know that's not going to work, right? And we're not willing to go try, and it's what I refer to in my book as the innovation antibodies. Oh, I'm the expert, don't try that, because I can tell you right now that that's not going to work, and that's bogus, right?
it's even worse than that, Phil, because what happens is there's a few things that we may have tried in the past, maybe a couple of times, and it worked for us, and then we assign causality to it. We just had a few observations, like 2 or 3 observations, and then we assume it's always true until the end of time.
Right, and that's it. We codify them, and people write books about it. And it's the rules of the way, like things like this is how the economy works, or this is how XYZ works, until someone challenges it. And typically, it's some new grad student who kind of has to go find new ground, right? And they go prove us wrong. So, hey, we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Stefan Thomke. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Stefan Thomke on his new book, Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. So, Stefan, one of the things, I've been involved in different projects where we've done, tried to work out experiments. We're going into new territory. We're not quite sure what's going to work. Do you see that there's a trap that gets created? Because if you do like a whole bunch of steps, aren't you getting kind of caught in just this increment, this, the battle of millimeters types of things? And does experimentation get correlated to incrementalism?
Of course, you got to be careful about what you're actually experimenting on. And it is true that there is a risk of iterating or experimenting on things that become less and less relevant. At the same time, we also need to appreciate the fact that most innovation in the world is, in fact, incremental. And sometimes big performance changes that we see are the result of the cumulative impact of a lot of these small changes. And that's especially true in the digital world, Phil, where small changes can make a big difference. Microsoft had this example which is described in the book, where an employee just changed sort of the way it displayed a headline. Well, it turned out that this small change, which only took a few days to actually implement, ended up sort of boosting revenue for Microsoft more than $100 million a year. So small stuff can actually be big money. So we got to be, especially now, I call it high velocity incrementalism, Phil.
And what do you mean by high velocity? Is that like just hundreds of experiments, or the ability to run an experiment, make a decision, and try again? Well, how do you think, when you say velocity, what do you mean?
Both.
Okay.
So I mean both. I mean, obviously you gotta run fast with this. And there are some theoretical limits coming from statistics in terms of how fast you can run. But at the same time, you also got to go for scale. If I run 10,000 live experiments a year on you and me, I don't care whether 90% fails, because I still got 1,000 that actually work. And if one of them gives me an extra 100 million, I don't really care what happens to the rest of them.
Well,
that's really what's at stake.
Well, it's almost taking the what I would call the Thomas Edison approach, right? Where he talks about how many different filaments he tried before he got one to work. Was it 10,000 experiments before he figured out that, it's like, look, I learned what doesn't work, but I found the one that does work, and, generated billions of dollars. Well, and as we were talking during the commercial break, my son-in-law, who listens to the show, so sorry, Oliver, you're going to hear this. I'm going to tell a story on you. He specializes in doing digital experiments for websites, etc., and tracking users, and doing the A/B testing. Give you 2 options, and I measure which one triggers the better response. And he and I had a conversation. This was years ago, with regards to specifically around color choices on buttons. What color? And he was testing like different shades of yellow, and I'm like, is it really that important? And he showed me some work that he was doing for a very large online retailer on different colors and tests and which got the best response. And I was quite surprised at, how do you use these experiments to uncover human nature that you really can't test for any other way, correct?
Yes, exactly. I mean, this is the problem, right? So how do you get answers to these questions? And let's suppose you have a new idea for a new color or in your headline or something. What do? You want to run a focus group? Well, we know we know people when people go into focus groups, they usually don't tell you, the truth. I mean, they don't actually what they actually say and what they later do is like two worlds apart. And so what do you actually trust? Do you trust what they say or do you trust what they do? I'd rather go with the behavior because you're not even aware of some of these differences. I looked at some of the color change stuff as well. And when you look at the colors, like, where A and B, I mean, these tests, you can't tell the difference.
I
But they
couldn't.
can measure, but they get a really significant result.
I know the slight yellow, and I'm like, am I colorblind? I can't even tell the difference, right? And then we get these, they would, with enough, like you said, you got to have enough to make it statistically significant. But it reveals something that, in my head, I would have said, why are we running that experiment? I know, there's no way the human's going to discern it. But then you run the experiment, and you're looking at it, and you're going, holy smokes! You uncover things you just never anticipated.
And and Phil, and sometimes we have a theory why people behave in a certain way, and sometimes we don't. We just don't know. We just know that it's an empirical fact. Now, as a business, do I really care? Well, sometimes, having an empirical fact is good enough to make a decision, as long as the experiment is well designed, that you can actually link cause and effect. And that's what it's all about again. At the end of the day, you want to know that if you take action A, outcome B happens, and you want to know with sort of a high level of confidence. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, well, and that's where I see some of the mistakes made with experiments, right? They're changing too many variables at the same time, and therefore you can't correlate, or you're biased to pick one of the variables that changed because you believe that has causal relationship, versus being very methodical about only changing one variable in the experiment. I've seen a lot of people try to do that and try to sneak the system.
Yeah, you got to be disciplined about that. But there are different kinds of experiments to run, Phil. What I call them, one type of experiment is the experiment that you just described, A, B, testing one variable at a time. But companies also run what I call exploration experiments, where you change many variables at the same time, and you would just want to get a sense of direction.
Okay.
Am I getting near the peak of the mountain here? And then once you have a sense of direction, you can go back to one variable at a time.
Yeah. Well, and you're right, because otherwise you are literally picking up grains of rice in a very large field, and that becomes hard to do, plus hard to stay with it. People will try to throw the towel in and grab something quick if they can, or validate some hypothesis they have through some randomness or whatever in the process. So in the case of these kinds of experiments, you shared Microsoft's discovery. We've got just a short amount of time here. Is there another quick example of something like that?
I mean, so there are lots of online examples I've got in the book, but there are also offline examples. It's also used in brick and mortar. Kohl's, for example, the big retailer, wanted to know whether it actually makes sense to open the stores an hour later, because they could save a lot of money if they did. How do you know whether this impacts revenue? You could just be brave and just do it, and get killed if it doesn't work, or you just run a set of experiments, which is what they ended up doing. They set up a discipline experiment, and they found out that it didn't really have a big difference. So,
that's great. That's a great example. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Stefan Thomke from Harvard Business, talking about his new book, Experimentation Works. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We're continuing our conversations with Stefan Thomke, talking about his book, Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. So, we were talking during the commercial break about companies and what companies are doing. How does this, play out? But more importantly, I'd like to take a step back, because one of the things, at least I'm a big proponent of, is around culture and a culture for innovation. So when you look across all the companies that you've talked to and you've done your research in writing the book and just your work as a professor, what are some of those attributes that you see that are needed in order to have this kind of, what I would call, I don't know, for lack of a better description, this experimentation culture? What are some of those things that organizations need to have or need to put in place?
So, Phil, you're absolutely right. What I found, sort of in general, that companies often assume if they just put the right tools into place, then this experimentation will kind of just happen. That's not true. It requires a total change of attitude. Here are some examples of some elements, that I think a company needs in order to do this successfully. First of all, is what we already talked about: is cultivating curiosity. You need to have curious people who value surprises. Because if you don't have that, this is not going to happen. So you need to hire for them, you need to cultivate them, you need to train them, and so forth. The second thing, Phil, is you need to insist that data trump opinions. And this is a big problem. And the reason is human nature. We tend to happily accept good results, and good basically means it confirms our biases, but we challenge and investigate bad results that basically go against our assumptions. The third element, Phil, is what I call democratizing experimentation. You need to empower people to run experiments. If you set up a lot of red tape in an organization, if they have to run it up the chain for every single experiment, you're not going to get the scale that you really need to run it at, like the thousands of experiments that some of these companies do. You need to be ethically sensitive, of course, because once you're running experiments, you have to think about sort of how you and me, as we participate, may react sort of to an experiment. And then you need to embrace a very different leadership models. Leaders in this kind of organization play a very different role than what they may be sort of accustomed to sort of in the past.
Well, and I think that's an important point, right? It's, in your book, you specifically call out how did you refer to it? The opinions of the high paid employees, right?
The highest paid person's opinion,
right? the hippo or whatever. Yeah.
And we know that hippos are the most dangerous animals in the world, right? They kill a lot of people.
Well, and this is the funny part, right? Because even at HP, I created this organization called the Innovation Program Office, and in fact, Harvard wrote a business case on IPO. It's used at Harvard and at Stanford, right? And part of the Innovation Program Office, even as the CTO, was I was excluded. I never participated in project selection. Because if I was even in the room, even just because I'm an engineer and the fact that I was in the room would influence the outcome. Because it was like, oh, Phil likes this project, so we'll fund it. And even at where I'm at now as a CEO, I run the same thing. I don't participate in project selection because of the influence. A friend of mine who's famous author, business books, he's been on the show 4 or 5 times. He was on the show right after I took over as the CEO, and he was very happily pointing out that I'm now the problem. At HP, I can always blame the CEOs. Oh, leaders don't get it. He was happily pointing out that now I'm a CEO. So now I'm part of the problem. But what is different about leaders in an experimentation culture? How do leaders have to act differently?
So there are a set of different roles, but I think, Phil, you may appreciate sort of what Upton Sinclair once said. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it, right? So, so you need to make some changes here, right? So I have 3 different roles, three different things I actually define in the book. The first one is to set a grand challenge. What you don't want to do is you have a lot of people basically experimenting willy-nilly in an organization with no sense of direction. That doesn't work. So the role of a leader is to set a grand challenge that you can break down in testable hypotheses. The second one is put in place systems, resources, and organizational designs, right? So, because if you don't have that, I mean, you can just go run around and tell people to experiment. If they don't have the systems, they don't have resources, they can't do it. And then the third, which I think is even more important, is to be a role model. You have to, as Google says, eat your own dog food. I mean, your leaders have to live by the same rules as everyone else and subject their own ideas to tests. And that's really, really hard. I had this, they have to display intellectual humility. And they have to say, bosses have to say that, I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong. And it's hard, if you get paid big bucks here, to make the tough decisions, to be the decision maker. It's tough to walk into a room and just admit in front of everybody that you just don't know what's going to happen, but you're really eager to find out.
Well, I want to push on this one a little bit because, look, innovation, I don't know, I classify it as the new buzzword bingo, right? How many times can a CEO use the word innovation in the shareholder letters and the annual report, right? It's all,
I counted it.
I did too. I used to collect CEO letters just to see, and you can see the trend line over years about how many more times the word innovation in, right?
I had our researchers, Phil, run a database search 2 years ago, and we found that more than 43,000 times in the United States alone in quarterly and annual sort of shareholder reports.
Yeah, and it's all bogus, right? Because when you really survey them, in fact, it's a Harvard study from years ago. You ask CEOs how confident they are in their organization's ability to innovate on a continuing basis. It only comes out to 35% of CEOs are confident, right? So you say it's important to your shareholders, it's important to your share price, it's important for your growth, but you don't know how the heck to do it, but you're not willing to step up and say, hey, I don't know.
Exactly.
Right? And it is this humility thing of not wanting to be the one standing out there on the edge of the being walked off the plank, by shareholders because of you admitting you don't know, right? How do you change that humility culture in today's business environment? Well, I have an opinion. I'm not a big fan of quarterly numbers, so that's I'll put my bias out there because I think that makes for bad innovation decisions.
One CEO told me is that, in this kind of environment, you can't have an ego thinking that you always know best. Mm-hmm. So it starts with a recognition that even the CEOs are wrong most of the time.
and I'm the proof point of that one. Let me tell you.
And CEOs have admitted. There was one CEO one time sort of told me this story, and I'm not gonna name the company. He said, they looked at all the successful decisions that they've made in their company that really generated money, and almost all the decisions were made on the front line. Basically people trying to solve problems on the front line, and then they looked at all the bad decisions that they made that lost them money, and most of these decisions were made in the boardroom.
Oh, that is classic. That is classic.
Yeah, so, when you write a book, I do collect a lot of quotes. So I want to maybe give you another one, which I absolutely loved. And this comes from Francis Bacon, who's kind of the forefather of the scientific method, right?
Yep.
1620. He said, if a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. And that's what it's all about, right? If you're so damn confident, about sort of doing, Mark Twain had a better version of that. He said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And that was the American version of this.
Well, yeah, and it is, right? And you think about even your own life, where you were sure something was going to come out a certain way, and then you get to the end of it. I had Peter Guber on. He's a longtime friend. He owns the Golden State Warriors. He's the chairman of Mandalay Entertainment, and he shared about movies. He goes, "Look, there's movies out there that I was absolutely confident were going to be blockbusters, right? We put a lot of money into them, and then, you lose $100 million on a film, right? It's going to be right. you're applying all your experience, and it just totally fails. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Hey, Stefan, when I was reading the book and looking through, all the content, great information, and we'll have links and all that at the show notes for people to find the book. But one of the topics that's very popular on this show that people really engage on is around the myths, right? It's the kind of the assumptions that people kind of go into, what they think are the truths about something. And in your book, you have the 7 myths around experimentation. So can you give us an example of like one of those myths, and then put that in context for us through the research you've done?
So Phil, I was giving a lecture, and there's a bunch of CEOs, founders, people sitting in a room. Yeah, there's like maybe 100 people or so. And I was talking about experimentation. Suddenly, one of the hands shoots up, and the guy says, "Stop! I don't really like that experimentation stuff. I've been telling my people that if you want to be innovative, you got to follow your intuition, your judgment, and all of this. And now you're telling me to experiment. That's going to kill basically all this intuition and judgment. I disagree with you." And I was trying to explain to him that this is not one or the other. It's not like when we experiment that we turn off all the other things that we do. This complements intuition and judgment, because you have good ideas, you may have some opinions on something, but you want to have some test that tells you whether you're right or not. So it's about bringing them together, doing all of it rather than doing one or the other.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? Because everybody thinks, I don't know, I think it's human nature to try to say, find the formula that gives me the answer. So if your book's about experimentations, if I read this book and I follow exactly what's in your book, my innovation problems are all solved, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work quite like that. It's not. Companies would love to flip a switch. Like I just take the book. I swallow the serum. And have that drink, and then the next day I have the superpower. Right.
Right. Exactly. And it's. Well, look, I used to run the global consulting practice at Computer Sciences Corporation, right? So I came from a Big Six early in my career, right? And that's the whole model of the Big Six. I remember the Champy days of business process reengineering, and we're out there schlepping that stuff. This will solve all your problems, right? You mentioned business process reengineering today, and someone will pull a gun out and shoot you, right? There's no magic one thing, right? So we have listeners of the show today that range from chief innovation officers at multinational larges all the way down to small entrepreneurs. What advice would you give them on how they should think about experimentation in the innovation processes that they're trying to do today?
I just tell them, just get started. Experimentation is the engine that drives innovation. You can't innovate without experimentation. And there's really no argument here. So you got to get going. And so I have, in the book, I describe this transformation process. You get started and you go through different levels of maturity as you go through this. I have an A, B, C, D, E model. Easy to remember. Phil. The A is for awareness, the B is for belief, the C is for commitment, the D is for diffusion, and the E is for embeddedness. And that's the highest level. That's like nirvana, right?
Yeah.
It's the highest level of running tens of thousands of experiments a year. Well, all these companies that I described, they started with an A. They didn't start with an E. They started, being small, running a few of those. You got to get going. And then, I describe in the book all the different actions that you have to take kind of to move up to the next level and to kind of get scale up and velocity up and all that.
So, Stefan, if, one is I wanted to congratulate you on a phenomenal book. And I think it's an important book, particularly where we are today as a society, and people are going to go try to find their new footing. now's the time to really take experimentation to a whole different level, because what we thought life was like before is different now, and you can't fall back on that gut and intuition. You have to be willing to do a methodical set of experiments to find that new normal, that new path. So congratulations on, one, a great topic and great timing on the book itself. If people want to follow you, where's the best place they can keep up on your work, your research, your writings?
There's a couple of places. I'm at Harvard Business School. I'm not going anywhere. And people can find me on LinkedIn. They just sent me a LinkedIn request to just mention that you heard me on Killer Innovations, and so I make the connection. They can come to my website on Harvard Business School. They can type in my name, www.thom which take you directly to the Harvard Business School website where all my publications are listed. They can send me email. We're academics. We're easy to find. We can't hide anywhere. So, yeah, and I do respond to these things, Phil.
Oh, that's great. We'll have all the links up in the show notes, so you can just hop over to Killer Innovations. And we'll have all the links to make it easy. So if you're writing in a car, do not be trying to write this down on a scrap piece of paper in the seat. Odds are, though, you're not in a car right now. But we will have everything up on the show notes to make it really easy for you to reach out and get connected to Stefan. Stefan, I want to thank you again for joining us here on Killer Innovations.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Great.
It's fun.
As we wrap up this week's show, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here at Killer Innovations. We are working to bring great guests. If you actually have a guest who you think would be great, something that the listener base would be interested in, just drop us a note. You can send me an email over at phil@killerinnovations.com, and then that actually will get reviewed by the team. If you want to email me directly, you can just drop an email to phil@philmckinney.com. That comes directly to me. It bypasses all the filters. Nobody reads it. I get it directly. You also want to stay close to and subscribe to the newsletter and over on the website. We are running a series of webinars. We've got one that we have just done, which would be on what we call disruptive shocks. Disruptive surprises and the changes that can have, good for what we're all going through right now. But if you want to hear about future webinars, subscribe to the newsletter over at killerinnovations.com. And with that, thank you for taking this time. Appreciate you following us. We'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.